Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. I'm joined by Carlos Tanner, who is the director of the Ayahuasca Foundation. You can find him online at ayahuascafoundation.org, which is both an educational center and also a retreat center located in South America, of course, where you find ayahuasca. We had a great conversation just a couple of weeks ago. It's a very personal conversation with Carlos, getting into his own healing journey and experiences and how he got into serving and working with ayahuasca. I think you'll find it quite fascinating, and looking forward to bringing this conversation to all of you. But first, a few quick announcements before we get there. I would like to say thank you to Stefan, who's made a monthly contribution in support of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast, just as he does every month. If you would like to support this podcast and help pay for the time it takes to put it all together every week, and also the bandwidth and storage for this podcast, making it available to everybody out there in listener land, it's quite easy. Just stop by my personal webpage at www.martinball.net and use the PayPal link at the top right of the page, or come on over to Patreon, where there is also a link on my personal webpage. That's patreon.com/martinwball, and you can also become a monthly supporter that way and choose the level that is most comfortable for you. Coming up on the podcast, I'm in the middle right now of reading Tom Hatzis's new book, LSD, The Wonder Child, The Golden Age of Psychedelic Research in the 1950s. And yeah, that's pretty much what it is about, looking at both psychiatrists and psychologists who were using LSD in the 1950s and developing therapeutic protocols, as well as MK Ultra and the military's interest in using LSD as a truth serum or possibly as a weapon. Of course, it's up to the usual standard of historical accuracy that Tom brings to all of his books about psychedelics. So really looking forward to having Tom back on the show. Of course, he's been here many times before talking about his book, Psychedelic Mystery Schools, or Mystery Traditions, I think it is, The Witch's Ointment, and also talks that he's given here in Ashland that I've featured here on the podcast. So it's going to be great to have Tom back, touch base with him, and get all the details about his new book, which is quite lengthy. So I've got quite a bit of reading to do before we have our conversation. But it's, of course, an enjoyable read with Tom's usual wit and humor. So enjoying that very much. Also, speaking of books, I mentioned the other week that I was just about done with my latest book, and it is now all officially done, and it has been launched, and it is available out there on Amazon and Kindle, both as paperback and as an ebook. This is a medical autobiography and memoir about myself. The title is A Sleep Story, an unintentional exploration of the altered states of being awake. And it chronicles my trouble with sleep, my lifelong trouble with sleep, and the current condition and disorder that I live with on a daily and nightly basis, and all the very many things that I've done to try and deal with it, and also just the chronology of my sleep and events in my life and observations and different therapeutic protocols and all that kind of stuff. And of course, it gets into psychedelics and psychedelic culture. So something there for everyone, but that's now available. It's called A Sleep Story, an unintentional exploration of the altered states of being awake. And yes, everybody always asks me, is it going to be an audiobook? Yes, it will. I'll be starting the production of that sometime relatively soon. So hopefully by the end of the year, that'll all be ready to go. But for now, it's available in paperback and ebook. Of course, next week, we'll have another chapter from Orabai's Vision. I hope you're enjoying this story. The full story is available at Audible, also in paperback and ebook, and the full Tales of Arduin 4-book collection is available in paperback and ebook. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this conversation. This is with Carlos Tanner, once again, from the Ayahuasca Foundation, and as I mentioned, you can find him at ayahuascafoundation.org. Here's our conversation from just a couple of weeks ago. Hope you enjoy it. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I was just taking a look at the email that you had sent to me, and it looks like we've got a lot to talk about. You mentioned your personal story of healing heroin addiction and ayahuasca and psychedelics used for healing trauma, the bioluminescent tree, scientific research, and, of course, the Ayahuasca Foundation, which you are the founder of, or you're the director, it says here, I see in the email, director of the Ayahuasca Foundation. And I've got your website up here. So we've got lots of stuff that we can talk about today. But let's go ahead and let's start where you mentioned, and actually that's where I like to start with people, is kind of what their personal story is and what got you into psychedelic healing in the first place. And it sounds like you had a rather serious issue that got you into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like when you talk about drug addiction, most people kind of want to make it into the like Hollywood depiction of it. But chances are, whoever is listening, knows a lot of drug addicts, but you might not know that they are drug addicts. There is such a thing, and probably the vast majority of drug addiction falls into this category where you're a functional drug addict. And I would have classified myself as a functional drug addict in the sense that I had a job. I was good at my job. I went to my job every day. Like no one knew that I had a drug problem, and not even really my close friends, because you kind of keep a separation in your life. Typically, like I hung out with junkies. I was a junkie. But yet all of us had our other life where people didn't know that we were junkies, And so anyway, that's maybe a little insight into drug addiction. But yes, I found myself kind of spiraling out of control. I had checked off all the boxes of success, and yet I was less and less fulfilled. And so I think that like disillusionment, but also the power of the conditioning of what success was taught to me to be, like I had the house, I had the car, I had the career, I had I had done it, right? I should be happy. I should be ready to like be an adult. And yet I was less and less fulfilled as I went along, but so convinced that it still was success that I felt, well, this is just what you have to accept. And I'll just start to drink more, and I'll start to take heavier drugs, and I'll start to like do things that help me essentially tolerate success. And that's where I found myself one night when I was drinking excessively at a bar, also doing drugs, and on my way home from the bar, blacked out behind the wheel. And I woke up underwater. Water was rushing in through the windows of the car because I had driven off the road into a river.
Oh, wow.
And I realized quickly that I needed to get out of the car, which I did. Thankfully, the window was down, and I swam to shore. And that was my rock bottom moment where I woke to the realization that I will most likely die if I keep this pattern. And so I really, literally that moment, like watching my car as it sank completely underwater and not having any idea how I got there, I made a declaration that I needed to make a significant change in my life. I needed to do something, that this wasn't going to be how I kept going. And then about 10 days later, I got an email from a friend who was in Iquitos, Peru, in the Amazon rainforest, and she had run into these two guys from Russia, Roman and Eugene, and they had told her about a shaman they knew, and they were going to drink ayahuasca in ceremonies with that shaman, and they invited her, and she decided to write to me to see if I wanted to fly down and attend those ceremonies with her. She didn't know anything that had happened, but I felt that that was a very bizarre timing to receive such an email, a very unique type of email. So I made an association that this was a response from the universe to my declaration, and it was an opportunity for me to make that profound change in my life that I wanted. So when I boarded the plane, when I obviously said yes, and when I boarded the plane to go to Peru, it wasn't to like try ayahuasca or see if this might help. I knew, because of the unusual nature of the communication and the way that it went down, like I call it a synchronicity, I knew it was a sign, like it was an omen. It was meant to be. So I had faith that this would be a transformative experience for me. And I bring that up because it was like, we talk about set and setting. I had the ultimate set.
Yeah.
where I knew that this was going to provide a profound change in my life, and thus that knowledge contributed to the profound change that I did experience. And during that time, the curandero named Don Juan told me it was my path to be a healer, and he invited me to become his apprentice. And so in 2003, I accepted his offer. In January 2004, I moved to Iquitos, Peru, into his home and lived with his family for 4 years, studying the science of plant medicine with him. And at the end of that, I came up with the idea for the Ayahuasca Foundation, which I did bring into a reality in 2009.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask you more about all that, but I would like to sort of back up just a moment to talk about this dissatisfaction with life that you experienced. And it just immediately brings to mind that yesterday I made a run to the grocery store and coming back and I'm listening to NPR on the radio in the car. And there was some rapper being interviewed. I have no idea who this guy was. But anyway, he was saying about how some other rapper like brought him on and suddenly he had achieved huge success. He's the wealthiest he had ever been in his life. And he was finally getting to make the records that he wanted to make. And it was like a Billboard top 10 or something. Again, I don't know because I don't know who the person was. But he also said that right at that time, he was the most depressed he's ever been. He was actively suicidal during that time period. And he described on the radio like actually holding the gun in his hand to his head. And so that's just what comes to mind as you mentioned that you had found success, that you were doing the things that supposedly life is supposed to bring you happiness. So I wonder what for you, if there's anything more, I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to, but at a personal level, where was that disjuncture between material success or the stated ideals of society of grow up, get a job, be successful, but then an unhappiness that's underneath that led you into these behaviors of escapism that then brought about the car crash and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex situation. Obviously, there were a lot of influences, but the overall feeling was that I had stopped following a path that I had just unconsciously kind of allowed to guide me. There was like the messages of the universe, so to speak, and so as to put some context, like prior to that, I had traveled around the country, like driven across country, stopped in places, lived where I wanted to. At one point, found myself living in Oregon because it was a beautiful place. Lived in Arizona for a little bit. Like I just I went kind of where the wind blew, you could say.
Yeah.
And that really was fulfilling for me because I guess maybe I felt free, but really I felt connected. Like I felt like there was an intuition guiding me, and that intuition I would define as like the reception of messaging from a higher power, maybe. Not that I'm terribly religious, nor was I then, and that's not what I mean. You know, I really mean kind of like I was a part of the world, and the world had a higher consciousness communicating to my lower consciousness as to when to move on or where to go or what to do, you know, and they were just kind of feelings, but it made me feel connected. And when I took a career job and settled down, I started to feel like that I had created like a stagnation, like that what was a flow was now turning into like a swamp. You know, I was just going around in the same circle, around and around. And that's why I started to feel less and less fulfilled, because I felt less and less connected to a whole. I felt literally like that there was a path and I had been following it. And at a certain point, I made a decision really because of this conditioning, because I just had the idea, well, I'm supposed to settle down. Like when you're young, you can do that stuff. And then you get older and you settle down. And settle down meant to like stop listening.
Yeah.
And I think I felt like I knew that on some level that there was the messaging still. And rather than like knowingly ignore it, I preferred to dull my ability to hear it, you know?
Yeah.
Like I would prefer not to know that there is something pulling me that I'm choosing not to follow. I'd prefer to like somehow dull my senses to the point where I can't hear the message. I can't feel the pull, and therefore it will allow me to tolerate the fact that I'm not following it.
Yeah.
And therefore I chose to take opiates. Like I chose to take these like literal like numbing agents, you know.
Yeah. So it sounds like you kind of moved from living in a state that was just more authentic with following what you wanted to do, feeling right about doing that and trusting in that. And then, yeah, sort of adopting those societal standards of settling down. And it's interesting that that seems to be a common theme for a lot of people who do sort of freely travel around and just kind of go here or there, and then often struggle with the idea of settling down and starting a career and feel that they've cut themselves off from that. I'm just really curious about that because I myself, I went directly from high school to college to graduate school. I never had a wander period. So that was never a part of my life. But I also went through a phase of my life where I felt, after all that, where I felt very inauthentic and felt that I needed to make some radical changes. So I can identify with at least that part of it. But I've never been a wanderer. But I can see how if that was something that was comfortable for you, that then denying that would be very hard. Just kind of shutting down a part of yourself that really gave you a sense of joy and freedom and connection.
Well, like I said, it's complex, so
Yeah.
I think it's only fair, and this may lead us into like the next topic of conversation, but there was something underneath that. No one just becomes a heroin addict because they're dissatisfied with their career. There's a deeper root, a cause, and for me that was a childhood trauma, and I wasn't too clear on it, though. It wasn't like an obvious trauma. In fact, I didn't have a specific memory of it until I drank ayahuasca, but the effects of it were clear. And I think that also contributed to why I enjoyed kind of being more nomadic, because my relationships never got too deep.
Right.
If you're traveling around, then you can keep these kind of superficial dynamics to your relationships, and it was the relationships dynamics that were getting infected, as they do with childhood traumas or traumas in general. So, I was like, I had found a satisfying way to avoid the infection of my traumas into my relationships by not allowing my relationships to go too deep. And then when I settled down, of course, that was when my relationships needed to go deep. And secondarily, or part of that, is that you don't just settle down to have a career. Typically, you settle down to also have a family. Like that's part of the vision, like the fantasy or whatever of success is that, yes, you settle down and you get a house that you share with a loved one, and then together you raise a family, and your career provides the means to support that. And so that's when like my trauma really started to kind of rear its ugly head, you could say, because when I was having deep relationships with partners, then it was the infection, as I refer to it, was becoming much more prevalent, and that was certainly contributing to the drug use as well as to the depression.
I'm just curious, you had mentioned before, but I just want to ask specifically, so did you keep this drug use secret from your partner at the time?
Well, in the beginning,
Yeah.
but then those partners don't last. Like when your partner realizes that you're doing drugs, usually there's a kind of it's me or
Yeah.
the drugs moment. And I would say, okay, well, I made my decision long before you and I met. So, like the drugs win. So that then kind of creates a filter for who your partners could be. And so I was with a drug addict also. And when you're with a drug addict, then the two of you don't have to deal with that
Yeah, just
me or the high road moment. Yeah.
yeah, it just becomes self-reinforcing. Well, thank you for sharing the more complex nuance of what might have also been driving that sort of wanderlust and nomadism within you, because even there, it's an interesting question that some people, as I mentioned, that idea of just being a nomad gives them a sense of freedom. But then for others, definitely can be a kind of avoidance. And even in you talking about it, I thought it was interesting that it reminded me of Jain philosophy, where the founder of Jainism, this religion from India, had part of his doctrine was don't stay anywhere more than 2 or 3 days, because if you do, then you'll develop friendships and you'll develop relationships and develop family, and all of that becomes attachment, and that just gets in the way of you reaching liberation and escaping from the wheel of reincarnation. So always wander was his philosophy. And then he also got rid of all of his clothes, and then he eventually starved himself to death. So I'm not necessarily a promoter of Jain philosophy, because I think it's a little bit too attached to non-attachment, but it just kind of reminded me of sort of that spiritual virtue of not having attachments, but maybe it's actually an avoidance at some level. And so, thank you for revealing that. So I'm curious then, in getting down to Peru and ayahuasca in particular, how that healing process went for you. And really specifically, I'm very curious about that first drinking of ayahuasca and how that went and what arose.
Oh man. Yeah, well, this was 2003, so there were very few, if any, like retreat centers. That wasn't like, you couldn't just look online and find a place to drink ayahuasca. That wasn't like a thing yet.
Yeah.
And so I was just going to this curandero's house, and I happened to, like I mentioned, like my friend met two people from Russia that happened to meet this man somehow, and so we were all like going together. But no one had given me any tips on preparation. I hadn't spoken with anyone about it. I was like pretty much blind going in, and my background, like I was a drug addict. If someone had told me that I should stop, I at least would have made the effort, but there was no communication like that. So I was using drugs like right up to the ceremony. I don't know if I don't remember if I used them that day, but definitely the day before,
Yeah.
If I had to guess, I would have done something probably that morning. And so that first ceremony was, oh man, that was horrendous. I mean, it was horrendous and fascinating, like combined, because the visuals and the experience were just jaw dropping, like how fascinating they were,
Mm-hmm.
how like incredibly real the visions were. It was so remarkable. It was like, being in a dream and knowing it's a dream, but yet but it seems so real,
Yeah.
But yet I threw up like 15 times. I crapped my pants. Like, I was like out of the dream. It was unbelievably uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And at one point I was crying in the fetal position. I had thrown my underwear into the jungle, and I was just in the fetal position in the grass, just crying, wondering what the hell I was doing. And again, like the most incredible synchronicity, which I had no idea at the time. The chief of the Achuari tribe was in that ceremony. Later, I would learn so much about like how unique that was, and how Don Juan had spent time with the Achuari as their curandero in his travels. But at the time, I'd never been to an ayahuasca ceremony. I'd never been to the Amazon rainforest. There were so many I'd never been,
Yeah.
that I just thought, okay, that apparently sometimes some indigenous chiefs show up to ceremonies, and he came out while I was crying, and he stopped. He came out and threw up like a champ, and then he saw me, and he didn't speak English or Spanish even, but he just gave me the like hand wave, like, come on back in,
Yeah.
and he was such a presence that I like instantly stood up. Like I was just like, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
time to
Like,
go back in. Yeah.
yeah, like got to go back in. And I just dust myself off and like went back in, and his presence was so valuable to me because one, I recognized that like this is all me.
Mm-hmm.
That guy drank the same cup that I drank. We both drank the same stuff.
Yeah.
Here I am, like flailing around like a fish out of water, and here he is, like perfectly composed. So this is on me, and that helped a lot because prior to that, I was like, "Fuck, this ayahuasca is like crazy," like what it does, instead of kind of recognizing my collaboration in this process.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very, very helpful. And then so when I did, that helped me to decide to do it again because I was definitely questioning that. But when I did go back to do it again, the second ceremony, I said like, I'm going to be a man tonight, and I sat in the posture of a chief, like in my mind, like, I tried to emulate this individual. He wasn't in the ceremony the next time, but it was obviously like a very influential situation to have my first ceremony be in, and I'm forever thankful that he was, even though I have no idea what his name was. I never spoke with him or anything,
Yeah.
but he was a big influence, and it was an important lesson for me.
Yeah, it sounds like things might have gone the completely opposite direction had he not been there, because you were so going through the ayahuasca cosmic ringer that you might have just said, screw it, I'm not doing this again. But then having just that energetic presence of like, well, damn, if this guy can handle it, and look at the poise he has. And so that gave you that inspiration to keep going back. So it sounds like a very fortunate synchronicity that he was there and able to, even just by the hand gesture and just by his presence, not any instructions or teachings or anything like that, but just through that simple presence to give you the temerity to say, okay, I'm going to man up, do it again, go back in, and really also in that moment with humility recognize that, well, I'm the one curled up in the fetal position. He just threw his underwear in the forest, right? That's me. That's not necessarily the ayahuasca. And that's such a powerful learning experience just within that to realize, okay, that there's some element here is me reacting to what's going on. And so what part of that can I then take responsibility for? And that, of course, is when healing actually happens.
Right. Well, I mean, you just hit the nail on the head there with, focusing on reaction or response is the term I'd rather use, because then you used a very key word, which was responsibility.
Yes.
Our ability to respond, which is in our domain. We have control over that ability. And how we choose to wield our ability to respond has an incredibly powerful effect on how we interpret our experiences and how we remember them. And how we remember our experiences is really what we call reality.
Yeah. So in your recollection then, at what point did you feel that the work with the ayahuasca had helped you to free yourself from the heroin addiction?
Well, the next ceremony, like I said, I went in with a very different perspective, and I had, I'm going to be a man, and tied to that was I'm not going to be afraid, because in that first ceremony, when I did go back after that helpful hand gesture, I started an analysis process, where I was now like, okay, this is me, so let me take a look at that. And I could see that like, oh, well, I was afraid, and I was letting my fear, as we all know how crazy it can get, like you unleash your fear and then your imagination can go wild with that. You hear one sound in the middle of the night and now you're like a murderer's coming through the door and going to kill you any second. And, and then you kind of like muster the courage to check on it and realize, oh no, there's like a squirrel eating a nut outside or something,
Yeah.
And so I made like a very clear declaration. I'm not going to be afraid. And that radically transformed my experience. Demons were angels, like just like that, like the things that I had been terrified by, I was now in awe of.
Isn't that incredible how that happens and how that
Yeah.
works? I mean, just literally, a demon can turn into an angel just like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's just incredible.
Right. And however, there was a point. So I was doing beautifully. The second ceremony, totally different. No fear. And if I did see something that could conjure some fearful response, I just would say, I'm not going to be afraid. And then it would transform. At least that's the way it appeared to me,
Yeah.
And the vision would transform. But there was a point where I saw a vine coming out of my stomach and out of my core, not the organ of my stomach, out of my being, and into the ground. And one of the incredible things about ayahuasca is that your imagination is this unbelievable tool, also similar to like lucid dreaming. If you're lucid dreaming and you want to have a roast beef sandwich, boom, you have a roast beef sandwich. It's very similar in the visionary space of ayahuasca. So I just, without really thinking, decided I want to know where this vine goes. So I started to follow it, and only in that way I could. So I just started pulling it down. I entered into ground, like started going underground, following this vine, and it was going like really far. Like it kept going. At one point, I was like, maybe I could just cut it. Like no, you gotta like
see what's at the end.
To the end, yeah. And it ended up like going. It literally felt like I went clear through the earth and came out the other side and went out into outer space. Like at one point, I was still following this vine that was attached to me out into outer space. And there it was, the end of the vine, and a pterodactyl. That's the best I could do to describe it. I mean, I literally think it was a pterodactyl. Of course, I can't say I've never seen exactly a pterodactyl. But there was this black, shiny creature that I could call a demon. Like that one fit like really clearly. Not that it was menacing or anything. And in fact, I wasn't even afraid of it. And I said immediately when I saw it, I just knew you were driving the car. Because it had freaked me out how, I kind of like said I drove off the road into a river, but I didn't just swerve. I blacked out that night and retraced my steps later, and I drove down the street, took a left at a light, went down Main Street, right through the center of my town, through 3 lights, took a left down Route 10, drove down, took a left on this street called Olive Street. Like I had an agenda. I had a route. Like I didn't just like black out and just like turn off the road.
You were going somewhere.
Yeah, I was going somewhere. Eventually, I winded down through a cornfield. Like it was like this crazy route that I took, and it really was bothersome that someone was driving the car. I'd never been on that road. There was no way I couldn't like say, "Oh, I fell into the program." Had I driven home, which would have been a right turn, maybe I could have figured something out. But I went the opposite direction. Like I went away from my house to some road I'd never been to that eventually led to driving across a cornfield into a river. So for me to say like you were driving the car, like I named it. You're stealing energy from me. Like you're attached to me. You're like this attachment. I hate to say entity, but whatever it is, like I knew that this was a problem in my life, and I pulled out a sword and I sliced that thing into pieces. And then I was afraid it might pull a like Terminator 3 and like melt back together. So I pulled a laser out. I'm floating in outer space, by the way, like in this vision. And I lasered the pieces into this dust. So then I was just like this dust floating. And that was satisfying. I had defeated the demon. And you asked the question, when did I know that I had beaten my addiction? Well, that was my addiction. In my mind, like I had just beaten my addiction. I had vaporized it, and I had destroyed it with my own power, And so that was, at that moment, I knew my personal truth had changed, and I would never do heroin. I never did heroin again, ever.
Wow, that's very powerful. I'm just curious, kind of back in that reference of lucid dreams and the roast beef sandwich. Before you wanted the sword and the laser, did you know you had a sword and a laser with you, or was it just like, I need a sword, and here's the sword, here's the laser? So you had all the tools that you needed, but didn't even need to know that you had them.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. So that was the second time.
Right, yeah. But something incredibly profound happened in the second ceremony as well. And later on in the ceremony, I felt a hand on my shoulder. And, like I said, I was doing so great in that. Like, comparatively, I was like master of my domain, I had thrown up once, but it was just once. And I did it like in control. I like kind of felt so great that I was able to do it the way that I had seen the chief do it.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
I felt like a chief. I was sitting like a chief and like, fully embodying it, like living in my manhood, you could say, or my adulthood.
Yeah.
And I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I knew I knew I was in a ceremony. I wasn't like lost in my visions or something. And I looked over and with my eyes open saw that there was a hand on my shoulder, and it was attached to a man who was standing next to me. I was sitting in a chair, and but he wasn't like a physical person the way that you and I think we are. This was like a person made of light, but I could feel his hand. And I'm looking at him with my eyes open. Like, it was very, very real.
Yeah.
But obviously not to the reality level of like other people that were in the ceremony with me. One of which was my friend Lydia, and she called out to me at that moment as I'm like trying to make heads or tails of how real this is. And this was not a dream. Like, your visions are like dreams in the sense that that you're kind of not there.
Yeah.
They're in your head, or they're out there in like another dimension. But this was right here. Like, I'm in the ceremony. I know where I am.
Yeah. And here's this dude.
And this dude is here.
Yeah.
I'm not there. He's here. And she called out to me right at that moment, saying, Carlos, I'm looking over at you, and it looks like there's a man standing next to you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that would have been an unbelievable coincidence, right? Like, out of nowhere, she just happens to think that there's a man standing next to me, if there wasn't. So I say, yes, I know. I'm looking at him right now. But it's okay. He's a good guy. I'm looking at him. His face, I can tell. He doesn't mean me any harm. He was standing in a supportive way, like when you put your hand on someone's shoulder. And she said, are you sure? Because it's freaking me out. And I said, yeah, I'm sure. At which point, what more convincing do I need? I was remarking how real this is. Well, I'm pretty sure she can't see my hallucination, right? Doesn't that kind of defy the definition? So I reached my hand. I put my hand out, and he took it. I shook his hand, and I asked him what his name was. And he told me. And as soon as he told me his name, I recognized him. And this was an important person from my childhood who I quickly, remembered had passed away earlier that year. And my godmother, my mom's best friend, had a son. And he was 10 years older than me, but we just for some reason kind of clicked. And so even though he was 10 years older than me, when I was like 8 and he was 18 or whatever, 7 and 17, I would go over and spend the night at his house, and we would go fishing at like 5 o'clock in the morning together. And I don't know, he didn't have any brothers, so maybe he like looked at me like that. Yeah. I did have brothers, but I still looked up to him. And so he was like, I'd like to say my god brother, because it was my godmother's son. And he had committed suicide earlier that year. Oh. And here he was. Now, because he was 10 years older than me, when he was 18 or whatever that age, like he went to college, he actually ended up joining the military. Like I never saw him again. So I hadn't seen this guy since I was 9 years old or something, you know? And, but when he told me his name, I recognized him. And then very quickly I was like, oh my, like you're dead, you know, like, oh my God, you know? So like, try to imagine, like my mind was like, just what is possible, you know, like everything is possible. And at somewhere in that flood of thoughts, I had the idea that if you commit suicide, which he had, then you're stuck in purgatory. And I'm not religious, so somewhere, you know, that had like thrown my way. And I assume it is a religious belief in some religion. My guess would be Catholicism,
Yeah.
but I am not Catholic by any means.
Yeah.
But at this point, you know, I don't know what's going on, you know, anything could be true. So I said hilariously, do you need my help? Like, can I help you to get out of purgatory? You know, is that why you're here? And he laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. And then he said, no, you need my help. And that was it. Honestly, I wish that we had more conversation because I wish I had asked him like a million questions, but that was the help. And at that point, you know, my belief system was radically transformed. But the most important transformation or aspect of the transformation was that spirits were real. You know, this wasn't an idea. This wasn't a concept that you either believe in or you don't. This was reality in my world. You know, my truth was set in stone that night, that spirits are as real as you or I, and that has never changed. And it's a very, very important truth for me. It, you know, really contributed to the rest of my life path ever since, and set me up really to do and be like who I am and do what I do.
Well, it sounds like a very powerful experience, and kind of at the representational level, what it just makes me think of is that since he is someone who was from your childhood, that was this really good, healthy relationship that was almost even spontaneous in the sense that you weren't brothers, but you were kind of living like brothers, that after freeing yourself from the demon, the pterodactyl demon out there in the heart of space that was driving your car and drove you into the river, that then there's kind of both a return to innocence through his presence, but also even coming with a warning, since he died by suicide, and that, you know, drug abuse that leads to eventual death is like kind of a form of suicide. So it seems like kind of embodying those two different dichotomies of innocence and then the self-destruction at the same time. And that's, in a sense, that's the help that you need, is awareness of both of those things, that you can be that innocent person, but you need to be aware and responsible so that you're not driving yourself, you know, or not letting the demon drive yourself. And so kind of bringing into a new state of being and relationship with yourself. And it just sounds incredibly powerful, especially to have that validated by your friend in that moment. And that really you being able to make the determination that, no, this person this is friendly. This is not something I need to be afraid of, but there's something here for me. And just sounds very, very powerful.
Yeah, to be honest, I never put that piece together the way that you just said it, about like the warning element, or, you know, about it being kind of an example of that destructiveness. I really saw it, and not that I'm denying that. I just never thought of it because I always focus so much on the impact of the experience itself. Mm-hmm. You know, I always will say, like, if I speak about it, I'm always like, you know, you could think that you believe in extraterrestrials or aliens, but if a UFO lands in your backyard and a couple of them walk out of it and shake your hand and say hi, you will never live your life the same. You know, like, no matter what anyone says, what anyone writes or what, like your experience, that experience will forever
Yeah.
solidify that truth for you. And that's what that did for me. And I say that because the next ceremony was the ceremony where Don Juan, the shaman, or the curandero as we call him, said that I had the potential, that it was my path to be a healer, and invited me to be his student. And I do, like, looking back, feel like, well, if you're going to work with plant spirits and you're going to be that type of healer, then you definitely need to have a very solid faith in spirits. You have to have a truth be that spirits are real. Obviously, if you're going to work with them in your profession or in your vocation, and there that had just happened. And so could he, like, see that I did have that truth? Could he see that and thus, like, make the determination or give the advice or say what he felt, And I guess that's how I do put those pieces together. But of course, there's another element to it, because my friend Lydia, as I mentioned, was there with me. And after those first ceremonies, like the first ceremony, I talked for like 4 hours to her, at her, really.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then after the second ceremony, I talked for like 4 hours at her. And I was so enthralled and lost in my own experience that I wasn't able to pick up that she wasn't telling me a story like that back. And so the third ceremony, again, like, that even went further for me. Like I mentioned, like, having a shaman tell you that you're supposed to be a shaman and that you can live with him as a, that's kind of a powerful moment too, to say the least, for me. But the third ceremony afterward, I noticed it for the first time, where she said, like, yeah, it was a great ceremony. After I had just, like, unleashed like 3 hours worth of visions and interactions and stories. And I said, like, are you seeing spirits and communicating with them? And she said, no. And I was like, what? Like, that's not happening? And, of course, like, I just assumed that this is what happens for everyone.
Yeah.
And so then when she told me that she was just kind of seeing some colors and patterns, I then started to make sense of what had just happened, where the curandero had said that I had this as my path. Because now, okay, if I'm, like, kind of unique in the depth of my visions and how quickly I am navigating this space, then maybe he's right. Which ultimately led to me, like, accepting that offer and actually moving down to the Amazon to live with him.
Yeah. So in that moment, or in that time period, was that just an obvious answer for you, or is that something that you had to mull over for a while and contemplate what it would mean, or was it just a no-brainer?
Well, while I was mulling it over, yeah, I'm not super sure how far I'll go, but, like, there was rock solid confirmation. I was in the ceremony. He didn't tell me after the ceremony. He told me in the middle of the ceremony. And so, still under the influence of ayahuasca, still in the visionary state, I started to mull it over. Like, oh my gosh, like, wow, like, be a shaman, huh? Like, like, the whole process. And at that point, a spirit came again, a different spirit, but also in such a real way that I could see with my eyes open and feel with my body, and confirmed, like, yeah, this is what you should do. And at least that was my interpretation. Of course, I will give credit that we're always in a state of interpretation, but I definitely, without a doubt, interpreted that experience to be, this is what you have to do. So there wasn't very much. I mean, there was this period of mulling that was ended with a very, very,
Right.
very solid confirmation that, yep, this is what I need to do.
So by the time the ceremony was over, you were ready?
Yep.
Yeah. So then, did that proceed immediately after that, or did you have to go back home and then return, or Were you just able to
Well,
jump in at that point?
it did proceed immediately because I wasn't at the end of my trip. Like I hadn't gotten to the point where I had my return ticket,
Yeah.
and I couldn't just stay there. That would have been a little bit, I guess, irresponsible of me. I still had my life.
Hmm.
I still had my girlfriend living in my house. I still had the house. I still had, I would have been kind of shitty of me to just like write, hey, sell everything I own, and it was nice
Yeah.
knowing you. I felt a little bit more of a responsibility to get home and tie up all those loose ends, which some of it was just kind of taken care of for me, which again, like, helped to reaffirm that I was making the right decision. But yeah, so I did jump in though. Like, so the next ceremony, which would have been the fourth ceremony, I sat next to the curandero instead of anywhere else. And I started singing along with him, which he told me to do. And he gave me his chacapa, like a healing tool made of leaves from the plant chacapa. And he gave me the bottle of ayahuasca at the end, like when it was time for me to leave. And he gave me mapachos and told me to smoke because I didn't smoke cigarettes. And like he said from that moment, like, he became my teacher and he started teaching me,
Yeah.
and I became his student and I started learning from him. Like the next ceremony, like 2 days later, I was acting like his student and he was acting like my teacher.
Yeah. So
But I then would go home for
yeah.
6 months and tie up all those loose ends and then come back. So that was in June of 2003, and then I came back in January of 2004.
Okay. So it all just fell into place. You were able to take care of what you needed to take care of, and then at that point, were you just back in Peru on a more permanent basis?
Yes, yeah. So I started living with him, and I still went back home. I went back home those first 3 Christmases, for example. It wasn't like I said goodbye forever to my family or my life, but yeah, my new life started, and it was in the Amazon rainforest in Iquitos.
Yeah. Well, it's really powerful to have this kind of open up in your life. I mean, I know that with a lot of drug addicts, one of the difficulties of getting off of drugs is that their life doesn't necessarily change and they're around the same people. And so they're around the same temptations and the same aggravations and triggers. They're all there. And that often people who were drug addicts, they become very bored with life. And so then they turn back to drugs or whatever it is. But here you're presented with really a brand new life that you weren't even consciously looking for, but all of a sudden there it is for you. And certainly it gave you something to focus on, gave you something to do, and gave you a whole new sense of identity and a whole new sense of purpose. So I mean, what a wonderful gift to receive that really right when you needed it.
Oh my God. I mean, just, yeah, I agree 1000%. I mean, to this, what an unbelievable blessing. I can't even begin to describe just how grateful I am. But I also kind of feel bad because I I've got this great story which you could sum up in a real quick sentence. I was a heroin addict and then I drank ayahuasca and then I never did heroin again.
Yeah.
But the complexity, the nuance, the details were very unique. Most people, like you say, like if you manage to free yourself of drug addiction, you're the bigger challenge is like making those important changes because you really do have to kind of redefine yourself and change your life dramatically. One of the pieces of advice that I give to people who are trying to do that is like move,
Mm-hmm.
like move to a different place where you don't know anyone. Because if you're a drug addict, then a lot of people are drug addicts. You're never a drug addict just by yourself. Like almost everybody is contributing somehow. And if you come back from a rehab or retreat or whatever, or even if you just, stop while you're at home, which is harder to do, but it can be done. But you tell those people like, hey, not doing drugs anymore. You're like an enemy.
Yeah.
you like flipped sides. You're the people that I've never understood, and you're the people that are against you, that don't get you, and that's a big challenge to people that are your friends, or you thought they were your friends, and now all of a sudden, you're like some enemy to them, and if you move and you don't have any friends, your chances of starting new friendships that are healthy, that don't revolve around drug use, are much better. And also, you don't have to deal with making up the excuse for why you're not going to get together with that drug addict friend that you used to spend so much time with, even though the time that you spent was grossly spent doing drugs.
Right.
So you can kind of like solve that and start a new life a lot easier, because ultimately you have to have a new life.
Yeah, and it sounds like one found you. So how long did the apprenticeship last? And when does your teacher say, okay, go serve, it's up to you now?
Yeah, well, there's no set, it's not like medical school or something. It's not
Yeah.
like a 4-year program, although it ended up being 4 years. I moved out of Don Juan's house like February or March of 2008, and I had moved in January of 2004. But there were a lot of reasons for that, and one important reason was that I had met a woman that I wanted to be my life partner, who is my wife now, and I was living, in a house that belonged to a shaman with his family.
Yeah.
And she started asking questions like, so, where's this going? Like, I'm gonna move into your shaman's house, and I hadn't thought it out before, and so that was like really where I was like, yeah, I should have my own place. Like, I should live on my own. Like, the two of us should live together, and that wasn't like immediately connected to not being his student anymore. But once I did move out, I became kind of free to visit another shaman. Like, I never had before. I'd met one curandero in the Amazon rainforest, and I'd moved in with him.
Yeah.
And lived with him for 4 years. I drank ayahuasca like 350 times or something, every time with him, and never with another person. So as soon as I moved out, it was kind of like, because people would tell me, I wasn't like all alone. I met people along the way during those years, and they would be like, oh, I drank in ceremony with this guy. You should drink with him, like, you should see how he does it, like, blah blah blah, and I was always like, no, I've got my teaching, like,
yeah.
That would be weird. Like, I live in his house. What am I gonna, like, go to another ceremony instead of his, and then come back and be like, yeah, I drank with a different? It would be like cheating on your wife or something. It's weird, but now that I lived on my own, it was okay.
Yeah, more open.
Yeah, so I did, and that just like kind of blew my mind, really, really, just because there was more than one way to do it. I was so locked into, like, this is how you do it. And then I drank with someone who was indigenous, a kokama, like different tradition altogether. And at first, of course, there was so much resistance, like, you're doing it all wrong, and then the realization that, oh, okay, there's more than one way to do this. And but then also, from speaking to other curanderos, I kind of began to see that maybe my first teacher was holding me back a bit, and maybe he didn't want me to be ready to leave, because I wasn't just his student. I was also kind of providing financial support, and maybe the arrangement of me staying as his student was beyond the simple dynamic of student and teacher and had other elements to consider, which I did, and I did actually feel like he was kind of purposely holding me back a bit.
Yeah.
And that really came from drinking with other curanderos. I drank with a curandero named Doña Otilia, who would then become my next teacher. And she was like, "Well, you've been drinking for 4 years. You opened the ceremony." And I was like, "I've never opened a ceremony." She's like, "Why not? You've been drinking for 4 years and he's never let you open the ceremony?" And, so like, now, of course, maybe there was some other elements, of course, relationships are very complicated, but
Yeah.
but at the time I did kind of feel like, yeah, why didn't he? And thank you for like acknowledging my ability, like, so yeah, so I did stop working with him at some point in 2008, and I started working with Doña Otilia. And that was also fascinating because she was a vegetalista, so she was like an herbalist, which was different than Don Juan, who was an ayahuasquero. So Don Juan did most of his healing in the ayahuasca ceremonies, which is also just kind of what I thought it was, But then I saw her, and she did most of her healings out of the ceremonies with plant treatments. And so it was kind of a whole new field for me to explore. But I honestly got to a similar point where I felt like she wasn't telling me everything. Like there would be times when I'd want information as to how she prepared this particular plant treatment that I was watching her give, but I didn't see her prepare. And she would be very vague about the preparation. Like she didn't really want me to know the secret recipe, which I can understand. I'm not saying that. I love Doña Otilia and I will love Don Juan forever. Unfortunately, he passed away in July this year. But I don't hold it against anyone to have a position where if it took you 2 decades to earn the wisdom that you have, that you might not be so inclined as to share it so freely with people so quickly. I don't judge anyone if they took that position. But would I prefer them to not? Would I rather that they are like, "Hey, let me share everything I know that I've learned in my entire life with you." Yeah, that's what I would love. And unbelievably, like I feel like I found that when I met Don Enrique Lopez. That's who, together with me, started the Ayahuasca Foundation in 2009. And we continue to work together, and I'm so like honored to be able to work with him because he really does just share it all. And part of that is I kind of feel that he's just on such a level that there's no threat at all. There's no worry that anybody's going to kind of catch him. But also that I do believe him when he says, which I believe too, that this is a science, and that if the scientists of our generation don't share everything they've learned with the next generation, then science doesn't progress. And so he has to share everything that he's learned so that the next generation can learn more. And man, doesn't that sound exactly like the way we should be doing things? So it's been a fantastic ride to be with him, and I look forward to like staying on the same page and continuing the projects that we're involved in for the next decade.
Well, it's nice to hear about sort of these nuances of the human nature of these relationships that get developed and the dynamics that sometimes appear between teacher and student, and withholding or generosity and someone's own sense of security within their own being and their own practice, and how they're willing or not willing to share that with others. Because of course, it's all human beings who are serving ayahuasca. And so there's going to be all these different human elements. And so it's just nice to hear these within your story and to recognize that there were limitations there, but you can still love the person, that they're a human being, so they've got their own concerns, like your first teacher. Well, he wanted to pay for his house. He wanted to pay for his family. And if you were a means to an end while also sharing with you, you got something from it, he got something from it, but then also to recognize the limitations of that dynamic and then discover something new. And yeah, then eventually the Ayahuasca Foundation. So tell us more about the Ayahuasca Foundation. And this, of course, for listeners, this would be the website that you have is ayahuascafoundation.org, which has got a great deal of links and information available there. And some nice pictures. Looks like a nice place. But tell us about the decision to put that together and all the different aspects of what the Ayahuasca Foundation is.
Sure. I appreciate you bringing it up. So in 2009, I held an event called the Curandero Seminar. And I had Don Yotilia there, and I had Don Lucho, who was the first curandero that I drank with after Don Juan. Don Juan didn't want to participate. So, we were always, I was with his family in July when he passed away, and every time I would be in the area, I would visit with him. It's not like we had a falling out. I will always view him as my maestro, but he wasn't too keen on the idea of having this seminar that I thought was a great idea. So I already kind of had these visions where I wanted to teach people from outside of the culture the principles and the belief systems and the ideologies and methodologies of this healing practice. And he wasn't so keen. He was my teacher, but he wasn't so keen on just being a teacher for people to teach on a day, in a workshop or something. And I understood that. So my plan was to have those three, and he didn't want to participate, but I had just met Don Enrique. I hadn't drank ayahuasca with him, but I could tell that he did want to teach. He just by talking to him, and he didn't know who I was. We weren't friends, but when we had met, he was still very willing to share so much with me that I really appreciated. So I asked him if he wanted to participate, and he did. And his ceremony, which was my first time drinking with him, as well as all the people that were in the seminar, was just oh my God, it was the most incredible ceremony I'd ever been in my life. And so the next morning I just said because I had already felt this really resonance, this guy likes to teach. This is the teacher that I've hoped for. The guy that you ask a question and he actually gives you more than what you asked. That's the guy that I want to be, or the person. I don't care if it's a guy or not. Yeah. And so the next morning I was like, look, I want to work with you. Let's do this. But he didn't have a camp. He didn't have a place to hold ceremonies. He had come to this this national reserve where I had rented the lodge to host this event. And those other two curanderos and my first teacher, they all had their own center, so to speak. Their own place. I'm not sure if I would call it a center, but they had a ceremony space where they held ceremonies. You could go there, But Don Enrique, he kind of lived in Belen in a shack. He was in the ghetto kind of, and that's saying a lot in Iquitos, Peru. It was a very poor place, and it wasn't the place where tourists would go, and it wasn't a place where you would even want to hold a ceremony. And so he said, well, I don't have any place to hold a ceremony. I was like, let's find a place. I know that I want to work with you, so let's just find a place. And I was in the National Reserve. I said to one of the employees that I had been working with, because I was renting the center, their lodge, if they happen to know of a place. And she said, yeah, in the reserve, there's a community called the Mishana community. And the next day I went to the office that managed the reserve, and I spoke with Hernan Tejo, and he made a call to the satellite phone of this community, and he set it up. And the next day Don Enrique and I got on a boat and went up the Nanai River to this tiny unknown community in the middle of a national reserve and saw this project that had like failed. Essentially, there was this grant to build this lodge in the hopes that it would provide financial support to this community that had been kind of unknowingly or unwantingly taken into a national reserve. They happened to be in the land that the government decided would now become a national reserve. So they couldn't use the resources for their own financial gain anymore. They couldn't cut down trees. They couldn't sell fish. They couldn't, because now it was a national reserve. And so there was a project to build a lodge that would then allow tourists to visit, and they would make money that way. But the funding got mismanaged, and so it was like 80% done, but not done enough that you could actually have guests. And so I saw the place. I was like, oh my God, like this is incredible.
Yeah.
This is unbelievable. Like, what's it going to take to finish this place? And figured that out. And again, like, as you can kind of see, there's synchronicities along the way in my story and in my life. My mother had passed away in 2009, and she left me some money. And so I used that money to finish this camp. And then we created the Ayahuasca Foundation together, which started with that camp in 2009, although it wasn't really finished until 2010. And then we held our first initiation course, which was a 6-week educational course taught by Don Enrique. And it was for people that wanted to learn the healing tradition of the Amazon and Ayahuasca. And that's how it all started. So we've been education focused ever since the inception, and now we're actually just this Saturday we'll be finishing our 45th initiation course, and so we've been doing those like 4 times a year, and it's been incredible to see that development. But we've also held smaller programs that are healing retreats. And right now we offer programs that are 10 days and 18 days. And we kind of created a new program, or I did, called the Empowerment Course, which is kind of my vision for the future of our understanding of healing, where we all return to taking responsibility for our health, and we return to the power that we have within us to achieve and maintain our health. And so the practice of that course is to use plant medicine techniques and ideologies and methodologies, but also incorporate with kind of new or other cultural practices like meditation and yoga and breath work and epigenetic reprogramming and things of that nature, all combined to provide enough understanding for us to be able to take care of ourselves, to return to health and maintain that health. And that's what we call the 4-week empowerment course. And then in 2013, I was offered a grant by the Grant Town Foundation out of Ohio to build a research center. And in 2017, we opened the Riospo Retreat and Research Center and started hosting research that was funded by the British Medical Research Council. And that research was just recently published in a journal called Frontiers in Psychiatry. And that showed really kind of jaw-dropping results. I was expecting a lot of the results, but there was an epigenetic element to the research. So they were actually studying gene expression, analyzing DNA and taking saliva samples to do genetic analysis. And they showed that there was a change in genetic expression as a result of doing an ayahuasca retreat. And that suggested that there may be genetic changes as a result of doing an ayahuasca retreat, or permanent results. So like a cure for depression or anxiety, or looking at trauma as well. Those were the 3 focuses. And so as an example, to demonstrate that the depression evaluations were done before, after, and then 6 months after a retreat. And there was a marked decrease in depression immediately after the retreat, which you would expect. But 6 months later, there was even further decrease in depression. So if you were to compare that to like a clinical trial of a pharmaceutical drug, for example, if you're taking the antidepressant medication, you would expect there to be a drop. But if you stopped taking it for 6 months, you would expect it to come back.
Right.
But not in this case. It actually was even less depression 6 months later with no treatment. And that really kind of contributed to this idea that perhaps it was actually cured, and then having the genetic expression, the epigenetic analysis kind of verify that, it really was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm curious with these studies, how many times were people drinking, and was this, you mentioned that it's kind of part of sort of like a retreat program, but is there other, was it involving these other elements that you've mentioned? Or because there's this distinction between psychedelic assisted therapy when it comes to depression and anxiety, which is you using the psychedelics in conjunction with other forms of therapy, usually talk therapy and standard therapeutic approaches, and then there's also just the direct psychedelic therapy, such as what you received, right, in your first couple of experiences with ayahuasca, that you weren't there seeing a therapist, that the work was being done in the ayahuasca experience itself. So I'm just wondering how that was packaged within these research studies.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and it's been like, it's a very common comment about the research, because the research definitely took a different approach than what you would call clinical. The clinical approach is very common to try to isolate. Isolation and clinical are almost like hand in hand, that you're isolating the effects of some particular substance or particular element, and we didn't do that. And so it was very like qualitative. It was a retreat. And then even to answer your question, like there wasn't even a distinction between our different retreat times. So the 4-week program, which is held at that center, and the 3-week or the 18-day program, which is also held at that center, and the shorter program of 10 days, and even an 8-day program, which we used to have, all of them were included as retreats. Now, they could have been separated in the analysis. So if you wanted to, like, the researchers could look at just the results of the 8-day, but what they found was that it didn't seem to make much of a difference. That if you attended an 8-day retreat, you had pretty much the same level of benefit than if you attended a 4-week retreat, which I was surprised at.
Yeah.
Now, their take on it was basically that, there's only so much that they measure. So, if you get to, like, there's only so less depressed you can get.
Right.
Like you can only go, so you can't like go further than not depressed, like there's no like beyond that. So they kind of chalk that up to one of the reasons, like if you can achieve in 8 days that you would never be diagnosed as depressed on a clinical scale or on, modern medical evaluation, then that's the same as what they were looking at, whether you're 4 weeks in. So they weren't really specifying maybe some of the nuances or the depth of what our consciousness is about. But regardless, those are great results. But yes, the results didn't isolate. So they didn't isolate the number of ceremonies. They didn't isolate the ceremonies individually, so you couldn't say what component of it had more effect. And I really feel like that is a better way to do it, because we have kind of played this game where we want to isolate, where we want to have this idea where you can break everything down into parts and evaluate the parts separate from the whole.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's as valuable as to understand the whole and to recognize that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And, I don't know if they were to isolate it. And, one common thing is like, well, how do you know that it wasn't just flying to the Amazon rainforest and living in a beautiful place that has no stress and eating healthy food, and like, yeah, I can't say, that definitely contributed to it, without a doubt. That was a contributing factor. And another contributing factor was definitely the mindset. I pointed out specifically like how I knew that my trip to the Amazon rainforest would be a profound experience for me. And most people that come have chosen to do an ayahuasca retreat in the Amazon rainforest because they have a similar belief. That wouldn't be the same if you were to do maybe a classical clinical trial.
Right.
You'd have a whole span of ideas and beliefs about what the outcome might be. And then if you threw in like that you're going to use some placebos or something of that nature, like, to me, you're kind of like messing with it and almost missing the point. And I guess that's where I'm at now, like what this whole process has brought me to. And maybe that can be summed up in a question that I started to ask, which is, do you know you're healed because you are? Or are you healed because you know you are? Like, which came first, the healing or the knowledge of healing?
Yeah.
And is this process, this tradition, this practice with psychedelics in this ancestral tradition an incredibly highly developed science of consciousness, of optimization of consciousness or enhancement of consciousness? And that's what I think it is. And I think the greatest lessons that we have to learn from not just the research, but just our awareness and study, and what I've come to learn so much, is that we always have that power to enhance our consciousness in everything that we do, but especially with medicine. And there are some elements to me that are obvious. Like, ayahuasca is always drunk in a ceremony. It's so obvious that I like don't even think about it, to me. But for a lot of people, if you say drink ayahuasca, they don't know that you obviously mean in a ceremony, because we don't have ceremonies. Ceremonies aren't a part of our health system, but maybe they should be. I think they should be. I think that if instead of going to get chemotherapy in a hospital, you went to a ceremony space, and instead of getting chemotherapy while watching TV and reading a magazine and distracting yourself from the process entirely and looking at it negatively and hating the experience before you even do it, because there's no ideology to form a context around the treatment, and there's no methodology that enhances your activation of consciousness in the process. I think if you did create a ceremony for chemotherapy that was in a separate space, away from a hospital, that used elements of an ayahuasca ceremony to enhance attention, so the lights go off, there's quiet, there's music played, all of these elements that help you to look inward, and the ideology is helped to be shaped so that nausea is part of the experience. It's part of the removal. The purgative experience is part of a cleanse that is contributing to the healing. All of those ideologies that are so well known within the ayahuasca tradition, if they were incorporated into a tradition, I want to call it, but a treatment like chemotherapy, then I just can't help but guarantee that the outcomes would be better. And so, can we take some of the elements from these ancestral traditions and learn how they are used to activate our consciousness for our own well-being in the healing processes of our modern culture? And can we optimize modern medicine through that incorporation? And is that really the lesson that we have? Because I do see this new field of psychedelic medicine emerging, but some of it seems to be just adding a new drug. And, is ketamine therapy the thing because the substance is different? Or can we learn more about how psychedelics have been used for thousands of years by all of our ancestors, no matter what heritage we come from, and learn about that ideology and methodology and change the way that we do medicine, the way that we understand it, and the way that we achieve health and maintain it. And that to me is like the real gem that we have the opportunity to learn from, because there are intact cultures like the Shipibo culture, like the people that we work with at our center. And I think that's probably the most valuable thing that I see coming out of this.
Yeah. Well, I really like, especially with these studies that were done, that it really is sort of the whole package, just as you're describing here, that it's not just trying to isolate, okay, let's take somebody with depression and let's just give them ayahuasca and see what results we get. But it is actually the travel, the arrival at the destination, being somewhere different with different people with a certain mindset. And as you say, the ideology of understanding that, okay, this is a medicine, but you're going to be purging, you might have diarrhea, you might be freaking out, that this is all part of the process, and letting people know that and not seen as a negative, but just as part of that. And I'm also not surprised at all that the positive results are virtually this indistinguishable, whether it was an 8-day program or an 8-week program. Because certainly what I see with when people are really open up to the transformative potential of psychedelics, that usually the biggest purges, the biggest transformations, they happen early on. And then after that, you have this process of sort of this nuanced fine tuning that can take place. So there's always more that you can do, but the biggest radical jumps, they're made usually at the very beginning of people's process. And then it's, a little more cleaning out, a little bit more freedom, a little bit more self-love, a little more fine-tuning of all of these elements. But if you're going to get a big result, it's usually going to show up pretty soon, And again, a lot of that is about the approach to it, that somebody who just goes and takes LSD and goes to a festival is not necessarily going to get a big transformative result, then years later. Because, I think you do consultations with people to help them integrate. That's something I do as well. And it's a common thing that I hear from people, especially who are older, who say, well, yeah, I took psychedelics as a kid, but, it was just for fun. But then when I went to Peru and I drank ayahuasca, it was a totally different thing. And all of a sudden I was encountering my childhood trauma, and I was throwing up all over the place and shitting my pants and screaming, and then finding profound levels of peace and love and bliss, So it really is part of how it's all approached and what is the total package. And I think it's a totally relevant question. I don't know if you're aware that here in Oregon, we've legalized psilocybin assisted therapy. And that's the big question right now that's in front of the psilocybin advisory board is, well, what are the programs actually going to look like? What is that going to entail? How are we going to be serving this? And also leave enough room for people to be able to be creative, and that there's not going to be a one model fits all uniform standard, but also still have basic standards that everybody is meeting, yet allow for diversity. So it's a practical question that is relevant right now here in Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's come up a lot, obviously. Now it's kind of funny just to see my own evolution, because I was I guess I would have called myself a very strict traditionalist. Like, I felt like it had to be done this way,
Yeah.
It had to be done the way that the indigenous people do it. And man, have I changed my mind on that so much. And one of it is I've taken to looking at nature as my guide in trying to make decisions or to understand the way the world is. And one thing is for sure, plants, one of their greatest gifts, and animals as well, they adapt. And so if you brought a plant from one environment into another environment, it would adapt. It would have to adapt.
Right.
In fact, we would applaud that it does adapt.
Yeah.
No one would think like that it shouldn't adapt. We would all say like, good for it, isn't it amazing? And so it's kind of like inevitable that if we're going to take a tradition from the Amazon rainforest and bring it to the United States, it's going to be different. It's going to need to be different. And that raises the question of like, well, how should it adapt? And I guess kind of where I'm at now is like, just legalize it all and just let people do it.
Yeah.
And the adaptations will take care of themselves. Like right right understanding and right practice will develop. And we don't have to have some like set standard that we all come to some agreement about. And so I guess I'm definitely for the legalization of psychedelics, if you can't tell, but I'm also like for our own human creativity. And yeah, would I want it to be shaped and guided by the influences that I've had in my life? Without a doubt. Like, that's why I'm talking to you. That's like kind of what I feel like is part of my mission, where I want to spread some of the ideas that I have about it in the hopes that it will lend to the adaptation of a new field of medicine that incorporates ancestral ideas, ancestral traditions. But I'm really result oriented, you know. And if it works better for someone to go into a clinic and lay on a bed with some eye shades on and take LSD and put on an Oculus Rift or listen to some music, like, if that's what works for them, then they should do that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great, because sort of the environment, the ecology of psychedelic healing, I think can have room for all of these things. Like, I think about my mom, who never has had any interest in psychedelics, but I think she really could benefit from a psychedelic experience. But for her, I know, like, and actually she goes to Peru, but she goes looking for birds and animals and things like that. So she's never gone to go actually drink ayahuasca, and it's never even crossed her mind that she would even do something like that. But I think she would really benefit from an experience. But for her, she'd probably want it to be in a safe, what she perceives as a safe clinical setting. And, you know, whereas I myself, I'd be more happy in the jungle, you know, doing something like that. So I think that there's room for all of that, and it can serve different clientele, different people, and that really, in my opinion, anyone could benefit from a powerful psychedelic experience, you know, with the understanding of certain mental disorders. You probably don't want to be giving people psychedelics and, you know, the other counterindications and concerns. But just at the general level, I think we could all benefit from it. It's changed your life. It's changed my life. And so it can change everybody's life in that sense. So really, with the specifics, there's lots of different things that people can sign up for with Ayahuasca Foundation, from the educational programs to actually healing retreats. So maybe just give us a little bit of a summary. And I see my son Jaden is around, so he's waiting to go swimming. So we could wrap it up after that. But just tell us a little bit of, you've already mentioned some of these things, but maybe just specifically again, what are the offerings that are available at ayahuascafoundation.org?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate, again, the opportunity to talk about it. So yeah, we have an 8-day healing, 8-week initiation course. That's for people that feel called to learn the tradition, a 4-week empowerment course, an 18-day healing retreat, and our 10-day healing retreat. And if I can, maybe I'll just quickly try to run through a 10-day healing retreat so that people can see that, you know, it's called an ayahuasca retreat, but there's actually a lot going on. And I point it out because outside of the Amazon, I don't see the combination of so many treatments happening, which I would love to see. If anyone's doing ceremonies, also incorporate this other stuff that I'm about to say. But so yeah, on a 10-day retreat, there are 5 ayahuasca ceremonies. But after the first ceremony, which is on a Sunday, on Monday morning, the whole group would wake up and take a purgative called sangre de grado, which is the resin of a tree called sangre de grado. And it cleanses your digestive system and it makes you throw up. That prepares your digestive system for the rest of the treatment. So almost all treatments in the Amazon tradition start with a purgative treatment, because you want to cleanse your digestive system first, because that's the food that you eat. So you want to absorb the nutrients in your food better. And you also will probably be taking other plant medicines, including ayahuasca, that you absorb through your digestive system. So you want to absorb those too. And then we start vapor baths. And vapor baths are the way that we do them. There are 5 plants. We call them cinco medicos. They're boiled. And then it's basically a sauna or a steam bath. That opens up your pores, a lot of sweating, releasing a lot of toxins. It's a detoxification process. And that would happen for the first 3 or 4 days. So that would be like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then Tuesday, there would be the second ceremony. And You would the whole group would also start taking remedies. So one remedy would be an anti-inflammatory. That main ingredient is turmeric. Another plant remedy that would be taken every day is a plant remedy that we refer to as blood brain, because it affects your blood and your brain, cleanses your circulatory system, and that main ingredient is pinon colorado. And a third plant, which some people refer to as the sensitive plant, in Shipibo it's called tanti rao, but when you touch the leaves they all fold together.
Right.
That is used to increase sensitivity. So everyone would take those plant remedies every day of the retreat, twice a day before their meals. And so that would obviously help with the anti-inflammatory, the cleansing of the circulatory system, the oxygenation of their blood, and the increase in sensitivity. All of them would contribute to more profound ceremonies, but also just better immune system function. On the fourth day, there would be a central nervous system cleanse using a plant called Chiricsanango, and that is an all-day experience. It's a pretty challenging. It's another like purge, but it's a purge of the nervous system, and then there would be smoke baths. Smoke baths help to cleanse negative energy. We're kind of familiar with smudging. This is like smudging for yourself, for your personal body, and then plant baths towards the end. So the beginning could be seen as like a lot of removal. And then the end is adding positive energy. Also, at some point, there's a sinus system cleanse with a plant called mukura. And then the ceremonies are every other day. So there's, in the end, 5 ceremonies. But there are all of these plant treatments. Pretty much every day, there's the remedies that you're taking, and then a vapor bath or a purgative or a central nervous system cleanse or a sinus system cleanse every day. And that entire package is what the plant medicine tradition would always have. So when you see it outside of the Amazon rainforest, oftentimes you see just go to a ceremony. Maybe there's 2 ceremonies over a weekend or something, but you don't see all those other elements, and
Right.
they definitely contribute a lot to the treatment. Now, on top of that or outside of that, we're offering yoga classes and morning meditations every day, or guided meditations, and we feel that those are very, very helpful. On the 10-day, we don't do too much of the epigenetic reprogramming or even the breath work, but those are on the longer programs, which are more comprehensive.
Yeah. And then how about the education course?
Oh man, the 8-week initiation course. The 4-week course is kind of a mini version of the 8-week course, but I'm so proud of that course. Like I said, we're about to finish our 45th course.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah, thank you. And we've had over 600 students do that course, and some of them have their own centers now in countries where it's legal, and some of them have started churches here in the United States. There are 3 different churches in the United States that were started by students that did our training course. And man, I mean, it's just an incredibly comprehensive course. But our goal is to teach right practice and right understanding about ceremony and about dietas, plant dietas, which is a whole nother podcast. And I would love, actually, if you want to get into that, but that's a big, big topic. But ultimately, that's how curanderos become curanderos, is through the practice of plant dietas, a relationship-building exercise that allows them to build deep relationships with the spirits of plants that they then call to be with them in ceremonies so that they can be guided and provide helpful insights to them as they attempt to heal the people that are attending those ceremonies. That course is just mind-boggling, and that's when it gets into the Noya Rao, the bioluminescent tree, which we have at our school. And that the students get to do plant dietas with that bioluminescent tree, which is quite literally an enlightened being.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have you back on because we've got some more to talk about. Don't think I've ever had anyone really get into the details of the dieta. Of course, it's come up a lot on the podcast, but we've never really talked about it. So I would love to have you back on at some point, and we can get into that. And I definitely want to hear about this bioluminescent tree. And I don't want to hear any more about it now because I just want to leave that bit of curiosity. And
Nice.
We'll pick this conversation up at another time. But Carlos, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate that you reached out to me and brought yourself and the Ayahuasca Foundation to my attention so that I could have you on today. And thank you for sharing the very personal elements of your story. I always think that that's really important for people to hear and help humanize this whole process that we're all going through. But just thank you for your time. I've really appreciated it today.
Oh, it's been awesome talking with you. I really, really enjoy talking to people that can listen to what I'm saying and you know, like contribute to the conversation, and that we can both like kind of get somewhere that we wouldn't have been able to without each other's collaboration. So I appreciate it for you having me on this show, and I definitely look forward to the next time that we can talk again.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much.